Hello everyone, and welcome to another of my tabletop game lecture series. I am Jason Bulmahn, the director of game design at Paizo and the creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game. And before we get started here today, I just want to give a huge shout out to thanks to all of you who have supported me on the Roll20 store, picking up the map tiles that I've been creating. I've been working feverishly these past few months to create a series of old school Bulmahn map tiles. And I finally uploaded the first couple sets to the Roll20 store. So for all of you who have come out in support of those and have asked for more, thank you. Thank you. I really do appreciate it. And we talked about it a little bit in last week's lecture on maps, and folks really seem to like it. So, but this week, we're talking about something else. We're talking about how to kind of nail that first session of a new campaign. Really, starting off a campaign on the right foot is super critical. It really can kind of set the stage for everything that's going to come in the future. Drawing the players into the story, getting them hooked on the narrative, and getting them coming back for more. And that's why it's so important, right? Those first moments, that first impression, can really kind of set the stage. If you do it wrong, you can derail everything you've planned about. I've done videos in the past here, in the past few weeks, about building your campaign, creating an adventure, having your session 0. This is that next critical step, having that first session and having it land the right way. So you got to spend some extra time, some extra energy on ensuring that this first session has kind of a tight, self-contained story with a good payoff that leads into a greater narrative to come. It's a challenge to do right. And I've spent years kind of perfecting my art on it. And I still have a long way to go, but hopefully I can share some tips with all of you. That way you don't have to spend years fumbling around and screwing up your first session. So let's get started with the first step in this first session, which is, I like to call it the first meeting. This isn't, the hook for the whole campaign. This is that moment where the player characters finally meet each other and decide, you know what, we're all gonna go on an adventure together. So this is kind of the starting out on the right foot in a session that's all about starting out on the right foot, right? So like it's double. Right, and this is the part that I've seen so many people cringe at cliche and things like that. That understanding this moment of a campaign is really important, because ultimately it's foundational. It's the keystone of the group itself. It's the story about how they came together, and doing it just right can kind of set the table for the entire story you're about to tell. And it's hard to do perfectly because it has to feel organic, even though you're planning it out in advance. It has to feel like a natural part of the world, something that's entirely probable, an entirely probable occurrence that just happens, that the players witness and as a result are drawn together to go on an adventure. It's really easy to go wrong on this, right? You can draw upon cliche. There's a wizard in the tavern who's hiring people. That's really tired. And you can also give into the temptation to go too big, right? All of a sudden, this huge Titanic thing is happening, and you're introducing your whole campaign plot in the first 5 minutes. That's a mistake too. This isn't the time to go and make some grand, huge statement about the campaign. You're taking the focus away from where it needs to be. And that's, not the spot you want to be. I mean, I've seen people start out the campaign by introducing the main villain. And this isn't a Saturday morning cartoon show, right? Where in the intro credits, you have to introduce the main characters and the main villains. That way everybody knows what's happening. Right? You can be more subtle. And you're making the moment about something that it's not supposed to be about. That moment is about them, because this is the start of their story. Your story is waiting. It's looming, but it's not there yet, and it doesn't need to be. This is the moment about the players and why they decided to join forces and go off on adventure. And so it needs to reflect that. Another thing that this moment is about is it's about establishing the normal, right? In the hero's journey, this is about, figuring out what the normal of the world is, right? It's hard to contrast all of the unusual, strange things that are to come unless you know what the baseline is. If the entire world is, bizarre occurrences, then another bizarre occurrence isn't anything noteworthy. But if you establish that baseline, if you say this is what the ordinary of the world is, then you've set the stage for when things change, when things become different. That is a notable thing. That is a thing that the players will latch on to and grow with. So it ends up being this, first domino in a long line of dominoes to get your story to where it needs to go. Now I'm going to give you some examples and some thoughts here. I think the way that you start out a campaign, that first moment, if we go back to a module I published recently, The Fall of Plaguestone, I decided the first moment was the players in the back of a bouncing wagon as it makes its way towards a small town. They don't really know each other. They're just folks traveling in the back of a wagon. That's how it begins. I mean, it's not much different than the Skyrim start, except for the fact that they were all prisoners and about to be beheaded. In this case, it's just a bunch of travelers in the back of a wagon heading to a town. It's that thin moment that binds them together. They were at that scene when the wolves attack. Sorry, spoilers. And as a result, they respond together. They're not bound in blood bonds yet. They're just travelers who came to each other's defense. And that first domino leads to the dwarven merchant inviting them to his dinner table, which then leads to the next step and the next step and the next step. It's just one tiny change in the normal. It's establishing what the world is and altering them within it. When I first started the first episode of Knights of Everflame, I'm going to come back to this example quite a bit. So, because I think the first episode of Knights of Everflame exemplifies every point I'm going to make here today, which is their first meeting was when they were being handed over to Andla to be shipped off to Lastwall, right? That was their first moment, was each one of them being assigned to her care to be escorted there, right? That's how they got to know each other. It's another journey. I like starting adventures on a journey. It doesn't have to be a journey, though. It could just be, a bunch of people are all in a shop all at once. A bunch of people were all called to an old friend's tower all at the same time. It's just that chance occurrence of all these folks running into each other. 4 strangers meet at a crossroads. There you go. Your adventure is off to a good start. But it's all about picking something that both feels normal and almost like chance brought them together. It helps define the world, but it also gives them a reason to act together. And that's the trick. So to sum up the first meeting, you want to start this session off on the right foot. This is a keystone moment where the PCs first come together as a group. It's an ordinary occurrence. And to stress this, it shouldn't be a main thing for your plot just yet. You should be looking for something ordinary to draw them into their first adventure. Oh, the farmer has a problem with his farm. There are, boars rampaging through his farm at night. You need to go deal with them. That's a perfectly reasonable, ordinary world kind of plot hook that then can lead them into something else. Oh, the boars were driven there because something unnatural is happening in the forest, and that's how the adventure gets pulled. The key here is that the first thing that happens is kind of ordinary, almost plain, seems, although dangerous, it's almost banal. It's an ordinary occurrence because you're setting that baseline. That way, when things get weird later, it all makes sense, and the weird has contrast. You want to avoid cliches, wizard in a tavern, signpost hiring adventurers. You generally don't want to hire the characters for their very first scene. That's not the way you want to go. Being hired to be friends, unless it's a story about a bunch of people who are hired to do a job together, then that makes sense. If that's the entire arc of the story that you're trying to tell, can they trust each other? How are they going to work together? They're all just mercenaries. That can be an interesting story, but you don't want to use that device when you're trying to get them to form bonds of friendship and be allies to one another. You don't want to go too big. This isn't the moment to introduce your main villain or your main plot line yet. You want to keep it focused on the players. It's their story. Focus that first scene on them. And use all of this to establish the normal. That's in the first part of the first session. That is the key thing you are trying to do, is give the baseline. If you think of Lord of the Rings, right? It starts in Hobbiton, a nice, normal, ordinary town. It's where life is quiet. Life is easy. And then as it gets bizarre, and as it gets strange, and as it gets dangerous, that always serves as a contrast to the quiet pastoral life that came before. It's a good tool, a good device. It's not the only device you can use. It's really not. And I want to stress, just like with all of my lectures, nothing I'm saying here is the only one true right way of doing any of this stuff. It's just, these are tried and true things that work very well when applied and used correctly. Of course, now that I'm telling you about them, now that the jig is up and you know about how these things work, they probably won't work as well in the future. But it's the price we pay for telling a good story. So, let's move on to part 2. And in part 2, what we're going to talk about is that first adventure. Once you get past the first meeting, you get into the meat of the first adventure, which I like to call the period where you're going to be looking for sizzle and shine. And basically, the thought here is you want the adventure to have some sizzle. It has to be exciting. It has to have moments of interesting adventure right off the get-go. And you also want to give every character at the table a moment to shine, to show their quality, to show what they're made of, right? Oh, Lord of the Rings on the brain. And so, as a result, that first adventure should be short, should be sweet, should be fun, it should be fast-paced. It doesn't have to be the whole adventure, right? You've written a campaign, you've written an adventure. It doesn't have to be the whole adventure. It just needs to be a good segment of it. Something that has a beginning, a middle, and end, even if it's within a larger plot, within a larger story. So, you're going to be looking for combats. You're going to be looking for role-playing. You're going to be looking for anything you can do that's going to allow the characters to exemplify the character that they've built. So let's talk about the encounters first. First of all, I highly recommend putting one as early in the adventure as you can possibly manage. So if we go back to Plaguestone, those you're introduced to everybody else on the back of a wagon, and 5 minutes later you're in the first fight. Everyone gets a chance to introduce themselves, describe what they look like, then you're coming up to the town and wolves attack. That's the very first thing that happens. That was designed very, very intentionally to avoid getting into long bits of role-playing before people start rolling dice. In a role-playing game, it's good to kind of throw people into some action early to draw their attention away from the distractions of the table, the distractions of their ordinary lives, and draw them into the story right away. Getting a combat very early on is a good thing, especially in your first session. Don't have the first session of a fantasy adventure role-playing game be role-playing for the first half. Throw a combat in there. Cram one in. Find a way to make one make sense and make it work. But once you get beyond that, once you get into the meat of it, you're going to want a nice mix of encounters. You're going to want role-playing, you're going to want combats, you want traps, or whatever makes sense for the story. But you're also going to want to within the combats themselves, have an interesting mix of encounters. You don't want them all to be against the same thing. You're going to want to avoid monsters that are typically very frustrating, or just a kind of a pain to run, especially in the early goings of a campaign. You remember, you're making a first impression on the players and their characters about this campaign. So if your first encounters are particularly obnoxious, that's going to color everything for at least several sessions. I mean, you can work against those preconceived notions early on, but it is an uphill battle. Folks tend to look for patterns in things, and if they find challenging, fights or encounters very early on, they're going to come to expect them later. That may not be the campaign you want to run. I generally find that for the first session, having the encounters trend a little bit toward the easy side is not a bad thing. I think the wolves notwithstanding, they were a little tougher than I thought they were going to be, but I generally try to ensure that my combats in that first session are a little light. I tend to go easy on the players, just a little bit. You're basically trying to give the players some cushion to learn their characters in an environment where mistakes are not going to be lethal. And that's the real trick, is that you want to give them a chance to figure out how their characters work. They've never played them before, right? Up to this point, it's been nothing but theory crafting. They've been staring at their abilities, looking at how they work and how they function, but they haven't actually seen how they interact with the other choices they've made. They haven't seen how they interact with the choices the other player characters have made. It can be a challenge. So going a little lighter, a little easier on those first encounters, can be a good call. It lets them experiment without having to deal with heavy resource management. You want to give your players basically a chance to flex, right? The monsters are showing up. Give your players a chance to flex. Let them show what they got. I would say that the counterpoint to this is don't make the threats irrelevant, right? It shouldn't feel like a cakewalk. The monsters should pose a danger to the players, but there's a difference between throwing moderate encounters at the party and throwing severe encounters at the party in the first day. You don't necessarily have to break out the severes the first day. Moderates will be plenty. I like my players to feel heat. I'm looking at chat, and there are folks who rightfully identify that some of my early encounters and some of my modules are actually kind of tough. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. I say one thing, I do another. Like I said, I'm learning too. It's not always the easiest. I would say, if you look at Crypt of the Everflame, the first fight that they had was against the Earth Elemental that was summoned. That was a cakewalk fight. There was no way that was going to challenge the PCs. But it did give them a chance to explore their character abilities nicely. And it was harder than it seemed because they didn't quite know the ins and outs of their characters fully yet. So it took them a bit. Nothing wrong with that. And that's the thing, right? It may seem like some of those early fights were harder than they appear, but that is purely because the player characters aren't working like a well-oiled machine yet. And as a result, they're not taking advantage of everything that they could be doing in the module, and it's already harder for them. So there's no need to throw something actually deadly at them. They will make it deadly by their inexperience. But beyond that, you also, want to use those combats and other parts of the adventure to make sure that that first adventure gives every character at the table a moment to kind of show off what their character can do. Now, in many cases, that's going to be combat, but not always, right? Basically, you as GM are just looking for excuses, both in the planning and the implementation of the adventure, to say yes to the PCs as much as possible when they're trying out new skills and abilities. Like, it's real easy to be like, oh, you want to roll an occultism check, and you know that what they're facing off against occultism maybe wouldn't tell them anything. You can still let them make the check, and if they roll really well, they can get some weird sort of occult trivia about the thing that just, is an adaptation of what you have. You're looking for an excuse to let them show off. It's the first session. No one knows what anyone can do yet. And if you don't give them a chance to show the other players, it may be sessions before that character becomes fully established. That's going to stymie your whole story. And there's two ways to do this. You can plan it and you can improvise it. Planning it is the thing you obviously should attempt to do, and you've probably already had the session 0 at this point. So the next thing you're going to want to do is look at what those characters are, look at what they've made, and then think about what you can put in their way that they are uniquely suited to overcome. So if you've got a rogue in the party and you want to put a fun encounter that they could bypass by sneaking, maybe you do that. If they've got a cleric in the party and you put a bunch of undead in to allow their heals to really shine, you can do that. You've got a barbarian who's good at slicing through hordes of bad guys. Well, throw hordes of bad guys at them. Super low-level monsters make great fodder. You got a bunch of spellcasters. Put in magical puzzles that they can solve with their skills. You've got a bunch of nature characters, a ranger and a druid. Putting in a trek through the wilderness is going to allow them to show off what they can do. It's all about looking at what the characters have and saying, what problems are they uniquely capable of solving that I can add to this to allow them to kind of step forward and say, aha, I can do this. Show everyone else at the table what they're made of and what they can pull off. But you should be prepared to improvise, because the players aren't always going to take the bait. You can put that encounter in there that is like, yep, here's some undead. I sure do hope the cleric has some heal spells left, and by the time they reach that encounter, the cleric doesn't. And now all of a sudden, what you were hoping was going to be an encounter that allows that player to really shine ends up being kind of frustrating. That happens. That's okay too. It's all about then looking for the next way in that session where you're going to improvise something to allow the cleric to be the star of the moment. And that's kind of what you're doing for the middle part of this adventure, whatever it is. And once again, this still isn't all about your main plot line yet. It should be an ordinary, straightforward adventure. Crypt of the Everflame was an adaptation of a storyline I ran a long time ago, which was the first adventure was this coming of age story. The player characters are all kids in town. They've come of age, and the town has a ritual to send their kids who come of age on an adventure to give them a taste of what the real world is like, and it goes tragically wrong. The point is, that wasn't the main arc of my story. That's just the story about how they got together, and how it went tragically wrong was the first breadcrumb that led to the main story. But they didn't get any sense of that in the first adventure. In the first adventure, they're just off doing this coming-of-age story. Right? If you look at Knights of the Everflame, the first session is all about traveling to Lastwall and making their way to the keep where they're going to be trained. That's what the story is at first. It changes by the end, but the meat of the story is really about them traveling there and what their lives are about to become. I'm establishing the normal and allowing them to breathe and experience that while also showcasing what their characters can do. Kind of all of this is about setting up a baseline that then when you deviate from it, it has meaning and feeling, right? If you think about some, famous, think about Dragonlance, right? The novel opens with all of them making their way to the inn. It doesn't start with draconians popping out all over the place and dragons. Those don't come until several chapters in. It's all about establishing the normal first, giving them moments of adventure, and then changing everything. Then everything becomes different. So, let's sum up the second part, the middle, the meat of the adventure, the sizzle and shine. This is the meat of your first session. It needs to include exciting combats and plenty of chances for the characters to shine. Encounters should be a mix of types. You don't want to do all animal encounters. You don't want to do all undead encounters. Primarily because you want to make sure that everybody has foes that they're uniquely suited to tackle. And usually that means different types. Not always, but usually. Avoid frustrating monsters, things that destroy equipment, or things that certain character types are just incapable of dealing with. Like, oozes should not be everything the players face in the first session, because anyone who relies on precision damage or critical hits is going to have a really bad time. And this is from the guy who just ran a session of Band of Bravos that had oozes in it. But that wasn't the first session. It was like session 9. So, that's more acceptable later on. You want to keep those early encounters a little bit on the easy side. You want to make sure that the players aren't being, in a life or death situation when they don't even fully know how to play their characters yet. Being able to fully understand how your character operates and get the most out of them takes several sessions. So in those first ones, you want to kind of not be putting your foot fully on the gas of how hard these encounters should be. You want to plan moments around the PC's abilities. Think about what skills they have, what class features they have, what feats they have, and what things among those that they're going to be able to use to really show off what their character is about. And in that first session, you want to try and use as many of those as you can, without making it feel very obvious, right? If the character is some, dwarven, the scion of a lost dwarven house, and they happen to find, the symbol of that house in the first adventure to allow him to identify, unless the adventure is about that, you probably want to save that for later. But, if the character has a penchant for cooking, and there's a way in the first adventure for them to showcase that, then that makes more sense, right? Don't go for the super obscure thing. Go for the more obvious thing. And then be prepared to improvise, right? The players aren't always going to take every hook you give them. In some cases, they're going to walk right past them and not show off their character. So be prepared to improvise so that when they do engage, you can find a way to say yes and allow them to show off what they're up to. All right. Let's get on to part 3. Probably almost the most critical part of the first adventure. The big hook. Unlike the start of the adventure where you're trying to give the players a reason to adventure together, by now, whatever that is should have fully formed itself, and they should have gone and done a bunch of those things, right? That first adventure is you're in the back of a wagon and wolves attack, and then you have a murder mystery you have to solve, and all of those things are being set up and established, but it's not quite the big hook yet, although arguably the first session of Plaguestone ends after dinner, if you know what I mean. The big hook is the thing that you end the session with, to give it a satisfying pause, to give it a moment of conclusion, to make the players feel like they accomplished something, while also laying down clues or a trail to a larger story. This is really critical. This is almost as critical as that first moment where it begins. This is the moment that keeps them coming back for more. So first of all, I should be clear, the first adventure does not need to conclude in the first session. It just needs to have progress and arrive at a satisfying point in the narrative, right? This is usually at the conclusion of some objective or the revelation of some bigger part of the story. But getting this to feel natural and right, it all comes from part 2. The sizzle and the shine, right? You're building toward this moment, and when you hit this moment, that's when the adventure can kind of come to a close, when that first adventure can wrap. But it has to feel earned, right? They have to feel like they've done some things, they've accomplished some things, they got to a reasonable part in the story, and it didn't feel like it was rushed just so that you could get there by the end. So it takes some planning in advance. It takes some understanding of how long it takes to get through combats in the game you're playing, how long the role-playing things are gonna take. And you're not always gonna get this right, but you have to try, right? In the first episode of Knights of the Everflame, I knew I only had 3 hours. That is the exact amount of time every episode was going to be. I had a few minutes wiggle on either side, but a few minutes is not much. So I had to be very, very careful in how I ran it, how I engaged with the players, when I got them to speed up, when I allowed them to kind of breathe and role play more, because I needed to adjust the time. It's a skill that takes practice. So as that first story becomes clear, and this is where the hook part of it actually comes in. It's not, oh, what's the next stage of this story? Where does it go from here? It's a tiny peek, a glimpse at the bigger story, at something larger. It's this is your true hook. You know, in Plague Stone, the first meeting is you're on the back of a wagon. That's not the hook. The hook isn't your wagon buddies. The hook comes later on in that adventure. I'm trying desperately here not to spoil it for anyone. In Everflame, which is now very old, and I don't feel bad about spoiling it, the hook is at the end of the first session when they arrive at Castle Everstand to find it in flames, to find it in chaos. They get a glimpse at something horrible is happening, and they are just getting a peek of it. You're trying to give them a sense of what the campaign is going to be, but it doesn't have to all happen, right? You're just trying to give them a sense of the mystery. You're trying to just give them a breadcrumb that's going to lead into your larger campaign. And it should feel incongruous. Like, that's the key to a good hook, is something that's like, wait, what? What just happened? If your players don't go, at the end of your first session, you haven't done it right. You want your players to be shocked. You want them to be kind of left going, what just happened? I really want to see how this continues to play out. It's you know, it's a cliffhanger kind of gimmick, but it works. And it's a good way to tease the rest of your story and really set the stage. You also want to make sure that the players don't have an easy way to solve it by just being like, oh yeah, we'll just do this and now we know what's happening, right? It should be something that they can't ultimately solve or at least understand yet. So that's the key, right? You know, if you, let me give you an example. Let's say we were going to do an adventure, a large campaign that deals with uprising of undead. There's a weird celestial occurrence that's about to happen, and all the dead are about to rise. It's like Judgment Day for the world, but it just happens. And you know, the players don't really understand that it's about to happen, but that's not what the first adventure is about. The first adventure is it is the Harvest Festival, and the folks in town are in the middle of preparing for this grandiose Harvest Festival where there's going to be pumpkin carving and stuff, and the farmer with the pumpkins doesn't show up. And the folks organizing it know the player characters and ask them to go find the farmer and bring him back. Well, they go to the farmer's pumpkin field only to find out that he's been kidnapped by a local tribe of gremlins who are upset about him planting pumpkins in his neighborhood. And you know, that's the adventure. And they go and deal with the gremlins, they rescue the farmer, and they bring him back. That's the first adventure. So we got the hook, they're at this harvest festival, and the farmer doesn't show up with the pumpkins. You've got the sizzle and the shine as they go and deal with gremlins, and everybody has a chance to show off what their character's about. And then we get to the hook at the end. And what's the hook? Well, they get back, and they solved it. Congrats. You solved this, or at least you saved the farmer, and maybe you still have to go deal with the rest of the gremlins, and maybe that's the first adventure arc. But what's the hook? The hook in this, I know I've got this undead apocalypse thing coming up. The hook of this is at the very end, a zombie wanders into town. Just walks into town. And that's how the adventure concludes, is an actual zombie walks into town. And everyone's left going, what? What just happened? That has nothing to do with this story, but it gives a teaser, a hint at the story that's to come. You know, obviously at the end of the first episode of Knights of Everflame, the undead were running everywhere, and the players, the hook there wasn't that the undead were rising. The hook was that the players were knighted, and that they had a responsibility, and that was the actual thrust of the first adventure. It wasn't the undead. It was the fact that they had been given a sacred duty and trust. That was the hook. The hook in Plague Stone is pretty obvious. when you get to it, you get to it, and I won't say more. Because that is a recent adventure that I know some folks are still playing. So, but that's the key to the hook working, is that it's something that comes out of the blue that you go, what is happening? I don't understand. I thought this story was one thing, but it's actually something else. So your first session is a little bit of subterfuge. Its job is to establish the characters, get them to know each other, get them to become invested in these characters through their successes and their trials, and then to change things on them, to move to your main story, to begin to introduce the main thrust of the plot that you're trying to develop. It gives them a chance to become invested before it's all on the line. It's a little hard to ask someone to care deeply about a character that they don't really know anything about, that hasn't had successes, that they haven't built up a connection to. So, to sum up, the big hook. Wrapping up the game is just as important as how it begins. Work to give a satisfying pause or conclusion in the story. It should feel earned. The things that they do up to this point should feel like they earned their way to that moment. But the hook itself should feel out of place. A mystery with no immediate answer, or a task that isn't easily resolved, that maybe they don't even know how to resolve yet. It should point to the larger story and give a sense of what is to come. You're basically just trying to... This is the elevator pitch for the entire campaign. You don't tell the players about it beforehand. You let them figure it out through play, to some extent. I mean, obviously, you talk to them about consent and what they want to play and stuff. But the actual details of the plot, you're not going to reveal those all from the first moment. Instead, you're going to give them a taste of it. You're going to let them play their characters, experience their characters, and then get pulled into the bigger story. That's the key. That's how you make it all work. So, that's kind of it. That's how you make the first session kind of magical. Like, it is all about setting up the stage, introducing the characters to each other, giving them a chance to play, to find out what their characters are really about, to find their character's voice, to find how they act, how they interact. And all the while, as GM, you are just setting up the stage. You are assembling the players, you are putting everything into motion, and at the very end of the session, you just want to take that first domino and knock it over. And let them know that there's something bigger out there, and that bigger thing is coming, and they are going to have to find a way to deal with it. It doesn't have to be the main villain. The main villain doesn't have to show up in the first adventure. The entire crux of the thing, you can leave it a mystery, but you're just trying to give a sense that something greater is about to happen, that they're about to walk into a much wider world that is far more dangerous and far more challenging than the fun time they just had. That's why establishing the fun time is important. You're giving them a sense of, this is what normal is. This is what ordinary adventurers deal with. But you're special. You're going to do great things. But it's not going to come without a price. And that's the way you get your player characters really engaged in a story. And it isn't the only way to do it. There are so many different ways you can do this. You can start, in media res. You can start in the middle of a fight, in the middle of the story, and then flash back to the beginning. There's so many tricks you can do, but this is the most basic way to start a successful campaign. There are literally dozens of ways that you can start a story. All of them are valid. They do take more effort and more work. If folks find this video particularly useful, I might go back and explore different ways to start a campaign, different ways to start a story. I think for those of you who are familiar with Everflame, Season 2 actually started with a moment in media res. I started in the middle of a fight, an ambush that was about to happen, and then between each round of encounter, I flashed back to describe how they got to where they were. It's a very very powerful storytelling technique, but it takes a lot of effort to set up and get right. Doable, but challenging. What I've described here today is kind of the most straightforward way to kind of set up a narrative and set up a story and get it going on the right foot. And I think it is a critical skill for GMs to master. So I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. We're going to keep these going. I give lectures every Saturday at 4 p.m. on my Twitch channel. That's twitch.tv/Jason Bulmahn. If you're there, after each lecture, we go and do some open-ended Q&A. So if you've got questions or thoughts and you want to talk to me directly, all you have to do is stop by my Twitch channel and you can get your questions answered too. Again, I want to thank folks for supporting me in my new map projects on Roll20. If you're interested in picking up some old school map tiles, you can find those by looking for Blue Maps or Minotaur Games on Roll20, and you can find my maps there ready for you to use to make your own wicked, devious adventures to play with on Roll20, which is pretty useful considering none of us are going anywhere right now. You can also find me on all the social medias, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all at /Jason Bulmahn. Thank you for watching, everybody, and we will see you next time.